Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are looking at Luke chapter 23. This is Luke's account of the crucifixion. It is fairly heavy. Jesus gets beaten extensively. We get a little bit of a snapshot of Pilate, a picture of Jesus carrying the cross. We get Jesus ultimately buried. It's always tough to talk about the crucifixion because it's probably the story that all of us have most likely heard the most. But there is a couple of inconsistencies we want to talk about. There's a couple things that Jenny noticed for the first time that we want to look at. And so let's dive into Luke 23.
Well, I don't know how in order you want to go because I think that, like you said, this story has been told and heard many times. I think coming right off of Easter, it's also, interesting to reflect on these things as well, as we've just been thinking about his death, burial, and resurrection. So I guess some of the things that really stuck out to me were the actual walk to the crucifixion as well as the crucifixion itself. But there's a couple of things on his way to the place where the cross would be set up. There was a man who comes along to carry the cross for him. So in verse 26, we're talking about this man named Simon who was coming, just kind of doing his thing. And they grab him and say, hey, you're going to carry this cross. So what's interesting is I oftentimes have the idea of Jesus carrying this the whole way, but there's actually someone else who's severely impacted by this whole thing simply because he was just there.
Yeah, most likely he was a religious pilgrim to Jerusalem for the Passover celebrations, and Jesus was badly beaten. So normally the convicted people would carry the cross, but he was unable to because he's been so badly beaten already. Something that is lost on us, and I haven't heard a ton of people talk about, Jerusalem at this time under Roman occupation is like this really, it's just very tense, and it's kind of a tinderbox at this point in time. There's this uneasy relationship between the Jews and the Romans. Herod is like the Jewish king under the Roman appointment, so he's not really a real king. He's kind of a puppet, but he is kind of put in place in partnership with these religious leaders to sort of keep the peace, but it's a really uneasy peace. And we also have Pilate being put in this region. A lot of times governors were put in this region as punishment, or either they were not as allegiant to the emperor as they wanted, or they did not do very well in their previous posts, so they were put here. So most likely Pilate does not love the fact that he's in this region, and his goal is basically to do whatever he can to keep the peace, which is why Pilate recognizes that Jesus is not guilty. He does not want to put Jesus to death because he does not believe him to be guilty, but also he does not want this region to erupt into an uprising or some kind of revolt, which is why the first thing he does is send Jesus over to Herod, like the Jewish authority under the Roman rule. This is not the Herod that was present when Jesus was born. This is a descendant of that Herod. And that Herod is just like, cool, I heard about Jesus. I wonder if he'll do a magic trick for us. That's like literally what the text says. Like, he wanted to see him do something miraculous. And when he doesn't, he ends up dressing him up, mocking him. His people mock him. They basically mock worship him as the king of the Jews. He goes back to Pilate. Pilate is very disappointed that Herod hasn't taken this because he wants it off of his plate. And so he tries to please the crowd. But when it's obvious that the place is going to erupt, it becomes quickly obvious that the Jews are going to revolt if they don't get what they want. So Pilate kind of begrudgingly allows Jesus to be crucified, even though he believes he's innocent.
So we have this man, this Simon guy, who is coming through.
Yep.
So I think it's interesting to think about how Jesus is actually looking, how he's probably seeming completely just trashed at this point. Like, he's beaten, battered by so many different audiences at this point, and he has to walk this humiliating path.
This beating that he endures, I don't love to go into the details all the time because it's really nasty. Like they would use these special whips that had weights, and a lot of times they had like almost like pointed
Barbs.
claws on them, and they were designed to actually rip the flesh from your body. So most likely, like, Jesus is incredibly beaten, to the point of almost like disfigurement, or like it would be a struggle to recognize who he is. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, like it's really hard to watch because it is most likely quite accurate, and it's terrible. Because he is taking on the punishment that we all deserve. He is taking on the sin of the world, and yet he remains silent. That is like a really great companion passage to read with this Luke 23 account would be Isaiah 53. If you read Isaiah 53 and then read Luke 23, it's very easy to see that Jesus is fulfilling a lot of what Isaiah has prophesied.
So after that, after this little run-in with Simon, there's the women who are on the sides of the street. And this is what caught my eye probably the most, just because I didn't totally understand what Jesus was saying to them. But they're mourning, they're sad, they're like totally shaken up by what's going on to Jesus. And he turns to them in verse 28 and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." Sorry, I should read this last part. "For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry?" So I guess what I didn't totally understand was, like, I get the idea of him warning Jerusalem because of what is happening. But I think that last part you had spoken to a little bit to like clear my understanding of what he was trying to tell them.
So the trickiest thing that he talks about is if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry?
Yeah.
It's like, what does that mean? There's two historical takes on this, and in typical God's plan your part fashion, I'll just tell you both and you can figure out what you think. One is, we know that Jesus himself has talked about the coming destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, we've talked about the stones being overturned.
The temple being
21.
destroyed. This happens between 68 and 70 AD. The Romans basically have had enough and they destroy the city. And so it very well could be that he's saying, like, hey, this time is coming. Like, if you think it looks bad for me, just wait until this entire city is destroyed. He also talked about that very recently. So basically he's saying, like, God's judgment is coming. If you think it looks bad for me, it's going to look really bad for people who reject God. And the early church, especially in the first, second, third centuries, they actively taught that God allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed and a lot of the Jews in Jerusalem to be destroyed because he was judging them for rejecting their Savior. So in the early church, it was a fairly firmly held belief that God's judgment rained down on these people for rejecting their Savior and for killing Jesus. Another way that you can look at this is he's saying, like, hey, look at me. Look at how much God is allowing his own son to go through to provide forgiveness for his people. Imagine how bad it will be for people who reject that forgiveness. Like, if God is going this far to make sure that forgiveness is available to his people, imagine how bad his judgment will be on those who reject the forgiveness of his that he offers through his son. So again, you could also say, like, yeah, and that judgment came quickly. For some of them, it came quickly. For some of us, it goes on much more. No matter what, judgment comes. We all have a personal responsibility to know and follow Jesus. And when we reject him, we come under judgment, and it will not be good.
Well, that part really caught my eye because I think there's these two instances where he's interacting with people who are just in the crowds, whether it's by his own choosing or it being forced upon him. Then he also starts interacting with these criminals, which is something that you thought was kind of like an easy thing to notice, but also there's like
it's
some
significant,
valid points here
and I
too.
want to point it out. This is most likely the most common story that you've heard. This is like Jesus is crucified with a thief on his left and a thief on his right. one of the thieves comes to a place, you can see in verse 42, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to them, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So this account looks like one of the thieves comes around to believing Jesus. One of the thieves is permitted into the kingdom. The problem is Mark 15 does not record this at all. Mark 15 just says that there were two thieves on his left and his right. Matthew 27, verse 44, actually says that these two thieves actually rebuked him the same way as the crowd. So it appears to be two completely different accounts. One says that this man essentially repented and believed. The other account in Matthew and Mark either ignore it altogether or actually seem like they're super antagonistic to Jesus. Which you might discover, and it might cause you to be like, oh, what's going on? And like I said, I don't want to avoid those things. I want to explain those things. Crucifixion took a very long time. And it covered a span of hours. It's actually incredibly possible that these guys started out rebuking Jesus, mocking Jesus just like everybody else. And over the course of watching the suffering that he was going through over those hours, one of those men came to recognize Jesus as the Son of God and ask for permission to enter paradise with him. I think that is what syncs up the two accounts and causes us not to doubt, but actually causes us to have firm faith. The other thing that helps to make that case is that in verse 47, you'll see that this centurion watches what's happened and is like, certainly this man was innocent. And another account actually says that he comes to the point of saying, this is truly the Son of God. And so the whatever is taking place, what the people are watching is leading them to make a decision, either to reject him completely or to embrace that what he's going through and what he's preaching is true.
If you look in verse 36 as well, when the soldiers are mocking him, they offer him sour wine, it sounds like a punishment almost, but I think it was a pretty common thing for people to drink. It's like a cheap wine, and it would have kept him around longer, but Jesus refuses it, which I'm sure probably stuck out as well to the other men who were being crucified, because I'm sure they were probably taking what was offered to them simply because, I don't know, if anybody, I don't want to die. That's not my first inkling to be like, oh yeah, just don't give me anything. But Jesus rejects that. And I'm wondering how much of that is also seen by the thief that is mentioned here. There is something different about this guy. He's not retaliating. He's not yelling back. He's rejecting things to keep him alive longer. So I think it's interesting that because of those choices, Jesus stands out probably even more so potentially to this thief. And that's just all my interpretation. But
it's important to recognize as we walk through this crucifixion thing, the important thing in the crucifixion is the audience, not the victim. This is an act of state terrorism that is meant to keep the people in line and in order. So crucifixion was used by the Romans. Other groups of people would impale people on stakes. This is why people have used guillotines. This is why people have used hangings. It's not about the victim. It's about the audience. They want the audience to see this is what happens when you work against Rome. And if you work against Rome, you're going to be punished. So the name of the game for crucifixion was to keep them alive as long as possible so that they would be suffering terribly for as long as possible. And like I said, I don't like to draw out the details because it's just gruesome and terrible. But it is interesting that Jesus actually dies pretty quickly, and it's most likely because he's been beaten so badly. But that also gets the attention of people. It's also why glorifying the cross is a little strange, because it's actually a very gruesome thing, and our forgiveness does not come from the cross. The cross is just an item. Our forgiveness comes from Jesus. We're not excited by the cross. We're excited by Jesus, the Son of God, who gave his life willingly on the cross and then rose from the dead. But I won't spoil the story.
Yeah. So I guess the last part that kind of stuck out before we kind of end this episode is there's this last part about when Jesus is being buried. So after his death, he's given this tomb. Essentially, it seems like this tomb of honor, a rich man's tomb, because of this man named Joseph from the town of Arimathea, which is significant because he was a member, from what verse 50 says, it says he's a member of the council and a good, righteous man. And it says also in 51, he did not consent to the decision, excuse me, and the actions that were taken in order to kill Jesus. So it is really I don't know, you have somebody who is like a part of the side that hated Jesus.
Exactly.
That is
He's a believer.
giving up his never used grave for Jesus. So is that, I don't know, that just feels like there's less and less room for the idea that, oh, somebody came and stole his body. Like, no, this was
Correct.
actually like a really high up man's grave. It was actually guarded by very strong men so that no one would come. And
Correct.
so it's interesting that is another piece that can easily be missed as well.
Isaiah 53:9 says, "And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." So basically, like, Jesus dies with the wicked. He dies with these thieves. He dies with people that are being crucified, and yet he's placed in a rich man's tomb. This is another fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus could not have set in order to kind of set himself up as this fake figurehead.
Right.
This is also a believing Jewish religious leader. A lot of times we love to make them the bad guys. We assume that they were all terrible. That is not true. Joseph of Arimathea was a believer. He was a follower of God. He was obedient to God. He saw who Jesus was and wanted to put Jesus in death in a place of honor. And so by doing that, not only is he obedient to God, he actually fulfills yet another prophecy. You have to read Isaiah 53 to go along with this reading.
And easily missed too. Like,
Yes.
had I not seen like that little part where it said that he was like this member of the council, like this
Right.
really well-off guy, because the whole idea of a rich man's tomb is like, no one's been laid there before.
Correct.
If he was such a terrible, awful criminal, I feel like in my mind, I just see him getting thrown into like a big pit somewhere.
Exactly. It'd be an unmarked
So,
thing. It'd be,
yeah.
who cares who this guy is? Your part for today is very simple. There are so many accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. We know he was a real person. Anybody that tells you that he's not is just a silly person. Do not listen to them. There's no question that Jesus was real. There's no question that Jesus was crucified. What plenty of people are free to question is if he was a liar or not. We obviously do not believe he was a liar. We believe that he conquered death, that he rose from the dead. We'll read about that tomorrow. And his power at this time is evident, and his power in our own lives is evident. So we can read this account, we can have confidence that it occurred, and that not only did it change the disciples' lives, because it did, they committed their own lives to serving Christ and gave their lives for it. We can do the same. We can be confident that this occurred. We can be confident that God sent his only son, that we could believe in him and have eternal life. And so we invite you to do that. It may be that you've never done that. We invite you to do that for the first time. It might be that you've done that a long time ago. We invite you to continue to remind yourself of the power of Christ in your life, because he is moving and he is working in your life, and you can trust him. We'll be back again tomorrow, wrapping up the book of Luke. We'll see you then.
Thanks for joining today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. As always, please consider partnering with us, as we are a listener-supported podcast that we hope to continue to grow with support from listeners just like you.
We've made it super easy to partner with us, and you can support us by following the link in our show notes or our description. You can support us with as little as $3 a month.
Every little bit of this helps so much, and we're so thankful for your support. With that in mind, here's today's reading.
Luke chapter 23. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man, as one who was misleading the people, And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who has been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" To others, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, he is the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. Now there was a man named Joseph, from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man, who had not consented to the decision and action, and he was looking for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud and laid him in a tomb cut in stone, where no one had ever yet been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how the body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.